Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here, and today I'm going to be taking a look at a topic that I think most people who are watching this video will be at least somewhat aware of, at least in the way that it impacts their kind of own gameplay, but not quite have the information available to understand just quite the grandiose scale on which it occurs, and that is spheres of influence. And no, I don't mean the board game. I mean it in more of the Cold War style, of beyond looking at who owns what on paper, and instead focusing on what major powers hold influence over lesser powers, and how this plays out in the grand chess game that is EVE's political scene. But first, for some context, let's take a look at the Alliance Sovereignty map that I'm sure you're all familiar with, to at least some degree. As you can see, it looks relatively diverse in terms of who holds what. However, even a basic understanding of the metagame of EVE would tell you that this is an inaccurate representation of who holds power over said Sov, because, as we all know, coalitions exist, wherein powerful alliances group up with smaller, less powerful alliances to hold a greater footprint of Sov and protect themselves from future attacks, which is why this map exists, showing the coalition sovereignty holdings. And believe it or not, this map is the reason why I wanted to make this video, as I think a lot of people kind of turn their brains off at this point and just take it as gospel, which, as we all know in EVE, is a terrible idea. But especially so in terms of coalition politics, as it doesn't really show where the battle lines themselves are drawn. One of the most egregious examples I can think of is the small collection of quote-unquote neutral states coalesced in the northern part of Red Swarm Federation's holdings, which, given that they're part of the Quirius Fight Club, a very distinctly Goon Swarm-allied entity, is just blatantly not true. So, in order to set the record straight here, what I'm going to do is run through what I see as the 4 major entities in the game right now, and attempt to fit the puzzle pieces of all the other entities in the game around them, to help fill in the information gap that some people watching this might have. Then, in a video that should hopefully be out soon, I'm going to run over the relationships between these major entities, and the predictions for some minor wars that I believe are going to happen this autumn, precipitated by Team 5-0's announcements of the replacement mechanic for outposts in Nullsec. If these wars do happen, I am going to call them the Gold Rush Wars though. I don't want to have another boring war name like the Winter War. Enough people have already called me unimaginative for that one. So, without further ado, let's start off with
the King in the North!
Or, as their friends call him, PAMFAM. This coalition formed the tip of the spear when it came to World War B, and cannibalized a lot of the smaller entities that sat in the surrounding regions after they were victorious in pushing out the Imperium from the area, granting them dominion over Fade, Tribute, and the Veil of the Silent. They've also been able to keep Venal relatively quiet, which, given how much of a thorn in the lion's paw it was for the Imperium, is quite the accomplishment. This coalition is centered around 3 bastions of elite PvP along EVE's history, folding together Pandemic Legion, Northern Coalition DOT, and Mercenary Coalition. And whilst the latter of those, Mercenary Coalition, might not technically be a part of the coalition on paper, they do hold Sov within the area of influence that PanFam holds, and if there was not any sort of diplomatic agreement there, I would be massively surprised. Alongside these core entities are 2 quote-unquote weaponized Nubro alliances, Pandemic Horde and Spaceship Samurai, both of whom are now well versed in the art of Entosis warfare, home defense, and general fleet combat, helping to bridge the gap between supercap dominance and subcap dominance. In addition, they also have their low-sec specialists of Waffles, and their renting alliance of Rate My Ticks. And now, almost as if by design, we run into one of those intricacies of EVE politics that I talked about earlier, as these 4 regions are not the extent of PanFam's influence in the area, just their direct conquests. In order to truly understand what is going on in the north, we have to understand that PanFam would not let anyone who they are not friendly with live in the north, and this goes beyond just mere standings, and looking more into diplomatic understandings between alliance leaders and respective non-invasion pacts, non-aggression pacts, and all the like. As such, we see Guardians of the Galaxy being able to hold Sov in 3 regions that surround the PanFam coalition, whilst being in what can only be described as a peacetime mentality, even though the primary alliance in the Guardians of the Galaxy coalition, Darkness Dot, having Pandemic Legion, the ostensible leader of the Pan-Fam coalition, set very deliberately red. As I expect that if some form of invading entity were to attempt to attack Pan-Fam, the coalition would be far more likely to attempt to defend their neighbours than to attempt to usurp them with some new power, due to the fact that the way things are currently set up for the Guardians of the Galaxy is beneficial to them. And equally for PanFam, having strong bordering alliances allows you a degree of safety with your sovereignty that you would not otherwise have, and cannot hold yourself due to the mechanics of Aegis Sov. But to go over the coalition in more detail, they are led by Darkness Dot, but beyond this they are the home of some of the smaller entities that were active during World War B, such as Chaos Theory, Blades of Grass, Mortis Angels, Slice, and the Methodical Alliance, as well as two newcomers to the area, Out of Sight Dot and Gladria. So with these two major powers of the North covered, let's take a look at Tenal, which is unfortunately where one of the flaws of my little colouring scheme become immediately apparent, as well as the predominant entity that controls Tenal, the Foxtopus Coalition, is, as far as I can tell, relatively unaligned in the great scheme of things. They do not control all of Tenal, with the west of it falling predominantly under the control of 3 different Guardians of the Galaxy members. However, for the purpose of not trying to get things messy and all geometrical and shit, I'm just going to colour these guys as grey. I will note any other disputed or split territories as I go around the map. Still, the Foxtopus Coalition are effectively the heirs of the old Drone Walkers Coalition, which in itself was a splinter faction of the Drone Region Federation, before coalescing into a single alliance, handily named the Drone Walkers, and following Test and CO2 down south as the Legacy Coalition to invade Catch. As such, this relatively small coalition has been able to park itself in some very, very valuable space. Though this in and of itself is not the most desirable of positions, especially given overtures being made by the Drone Region Federation in the past couple of weeks, with Fortizars and other strategic structures within Venal being targeted, potentially signalling that the DRF is probing for weaknesses ahead of a future invasion. Although only time will tell if the Renting Empire decides it's worth it to stretch its legs into this area once again. As far as I can tell, this coalition does seem to be predominantly German-based, with the Galactic Skyfleet Empire and League of Unaligned Master Pilots making up the vast majority of its numbers, though it also includes Just Let It Happen and Combat Wombat within its ranks. Keeping this train moving clockwise, however, we run into one of the biggest and, quite honestly, one of the most stable powers in the political game of New Eden, Glorious Mother Russia! Sorry, I mean the Drone Region Federation, whose dominance of the eastern part of the map really has not been challenged since the rise of the N3 coalition. In fact, the presence of a Russian-speaking alliance holding the eastern part of the map has become somewhat of a common factor throughout EVE Online's history, falling right up there with community-accepted truths such as PL always uses capitals and AAA is shit. However, it has to be said that this is probably one of the strongest iterations of a Russian power block that the game has seen in a very, very long time, with long-standing enemies Legion of XX Death XX and Solar Fleet, whose grudges can be traced back all the way to 2011, have joined banners in order to create this coalition. This means that they hold the vast majority of the Russian speakers in the game, especially when the other alliances that fall under their banner are taken into account, with their only major competition for recruitment coming from the south in both the Stain Wagon Coalition and the Red Menace Coalition, which has folded into the Imperium to create the Red Swarm Federation. Though it should be noted that some smaller Russian entities such as Out of Sight Dot do exist, they just simply do not compete for the same type of player as Legion of XX Death or Solar Fleet. The true political machinations of the DRF are going to be forever lost on myself, simply due to the fact that I don't speak Russian, and I'm not close friends with any of the major leadership within the DRF. However, the actions that they have taken within the game are rather interesting and very different to the approach that other major powers have taken so far, with attempts being made to remain fastidiously neutral in anything that does not directly benefit them. For example, they refused to choose a side during World War B, directly third-partying on several timers, but not particularly favouring one side over the other. In fact, they went as far as to excommunicate a group of the DRF known as the Drone Walkers from the coalition as a result of them directly aligning against the Imperium in said war, whilst also ensuring that they're in the Pan-Fam Coalition's good books, as we can see from their purchase of the Bot or Brothers of Tangra alliance from Pandemic Legion following the dissolution of the N3 coalition, and therefore Pandemic Legion's ability to protect its renter space. Personally, I would postulate that this is a part of simply how renting functions as a top-down income source. It heavily disincentivizes war if you already have a large, stable renting base and a large amount of regions to rent out, as direct conflict with a motivated enemy will likely lead to your renters being camped and killed, which can lead to rent not being paid, leading to less ISK. However, that is just speculation as to the motivations on my part. Getting back to the concrete facts, however, let's take a look at the alliances which make up the Drone Region Federation. As I previously talked about, the two major alliances that make up the Drone Region Federation in terms of its combat numbers are Solar Fleet and XIX, or Legion of XX Death. However, it also includes some slightly smaller alliances, such as Infinity Space, the Prothean Alliance, Badfellas, Razor, Boss Alliance, Solar Wing, Everybody Lies, Cohortes Triari in Panic, Advent of Fate, Synergy of Steel, and the Explicit Alliance, and I'm sure many, many more. In addition to this, between the two major renting alliances of the Coalition, Brothers of Tangra and Shadow of XX Death XX, you have just shy of 12,000 members. And whilst renter militias are obviously not a thing in EVE, that's still a huge number and something to be aware of. Given the patterns that we saw in the north, you might reasonably assume that such a powerful entity as the DRF would have some level of influence over the southeast of the map. And if you did so, you'd be entirely correct, with the Triumvirate-led Vanguard Coalition falling directly within their spheres of influence, and holding both Innsmother, Wicked Creek, and Detroit. Much like with the Guardians of the Galaxy, this relationship is somewhat tenuous and, admittedly, hard to prove, with us having to look at their past actions in previous political events to ascertain what is influencing their decisions, if anything. For example, during the Winter War, we saw the Vanguard Coalition fight on the side of the Stain Fragging Coalition, working to both evict and destabilize the Stain Wagon Coalition, which was defending the area, which, as explored in my video Prelude to a Winter War, is something that would have been a point of pride to the DRF itself. In addition, another factor which indicates a relationship here is Triumvirate's long-standing involvement in the Russian political scene, with them being one of Solar's key allies in the XIX vs Solar War in 2015, the conclusion of which in the summer of 2015 led to the signing of peace accords, which in turn bolstered and created this new DRF, with this partnership even being directly acknowledged by one of their main FCs, Captain Patrick Archer, in an interview with Boom Boom Knack. Still, their status as politically influenced by the DRF does not mean that one should discount them as a powerful entity unto themselves, with a fairly sizable and powerful shield-based super capital and capital fleet being at their disposal, making themselves one of the few unique entities that prefer shield over armor in terms of their capital compositions. And whilst Triumvirate is known for its preponderance of deployments, especially within recent months, currently being engaged in the north fighting the Guardians of the Galaxy coalition, it does not lack for allies to hold down the fort, as it were, in its southeasterly holdings, with the other notable members of the coalition being Hell's Pirates, Invidia Gloria Comes, Reforged, and Stellar Nova. Unfortunately, from here we move to a pair of regions which I have admittedly less knowledge of, the Great Wildlands and Scalding Pass. Fortunately, however, they don't seem to have any major players within the Great Game, being a relatively neutral region. Although, much as we saw with Western Timor, Eastern Scolding Pass, due to its inter-regional connectivity between holdings of the DRF and DRF-aligned entities, is currently being held by both the Prothean Alliance, a member of the DRF directly, and Stellar Nova, a member of the Vanguard Coalition. Beyond this, however, it does seem to be held by relatively neutral powers. Although, interestingly, no major coalition seems to have taken control here, with neutral standings being kept between many of the major alliances which hold SOV. Though from what I can tell, there is at least some degree of a non-invasion pact in effect, given the lack of timers between these entities over the course of the past couple of months. Great Wildlands is even more of an enigma to me, given that I don't have any sovereignty to be able to get my bearings in terms of who holds power over the region. However, I will note that the Great Wildlands does still hold some amount of NRDS activity, it being one of the regions along with Providence that has a history with the not red don't shoot philosophy in terms of combat engagement. Though from what I can gather, that is not the pervasive rule of engagement for the entirety of the Great Wildlands, just for a few entities which still thrive in the area. Notable alliances involved very specifically in Scolding Pass include Freedom Among the Stars, an ex-Stainwagon member, the Bastard Cartel, a primarily PvP-focused alliance which recently became semi-Reddit famous after a member of theirs was recruitment scammed for 2 nixes by Goonswarm, Bright Side of Death, a small gang-focused entity which I have a lot of respect for, Fraternity Dot, a Chinese alliance which plays on tranquility, and Intrepid Crossing, an alliance which used to live up in Cobalt Edge back in 2013 before being evicted by Razer, which funnily enough was the first time I ever cut my teeth in terms of strategic FCing. Skipping along to another relatively minor region, we head off to Curse, which is an NPC region that holds a very storied background, with it having been everything from a small gang paradise, much like Syndicate in the north, through being the home of the Initiative, to being considered simply a prime place to deploy if you wanted to hit the soft underbelly of the south. Right now, however, there are no native entities that thrive within Curse, which, given both the relative ease of getting SOV in Scolding Pass, and the recent wars in the south, both having left opportunities for entities to outgrow this area and move into SOV Null. Given that, Curse has returned to what it previously was, simply a great place to deploy, with Pandemic Legion making use of some of its old capital stockpiles within the region to wreak havoc on the new Legacy Coalition. Interestingly, we've also seen some form of small counter-deployment by the Red Swarm Federation, with Goonswarm's Space Violence SIG, as led by Kendar, being deployed in the region as well, though to a lesser degree than the PanFam is involved here. Moving directly south from Curse, however, we find ourselves looking at 2 regions which are both vastly more wealthy, and as a result of that, vastly more contested in recent history, that of Amency and Tenerifis, which are currently being held by the Fidelis Constans-led Phoenix Federation. This coalition is in a very interesting place politically, given that the main alliance which serves as an anchor for the coalition is an ex-member of the Imperium, as well as them being sandwiched between both the Legacy Coalition, which we'll get onto later, and the DRF-aligned Vanguard Coalition, with simply them moving to this area originally having started political troubles with the Vanguard Coalition, leading to a series of battles in which FCON was rather badly mauled, at which point the war seemed to simply peter out, indicating that some form of diplomatic agreement between the 2 entities was reached. This diplomatic agreement seemed to lead to some form of political control, especially during the Winter War, wherein the Phoenix Federation decided to eschew their own existing political agreements with the Stainwagon Coalition, most notably a non-invasion pact between the 2 entities, in pursuit of assisting the attacking entities. In addition, however, there are some political ties between this faction and the Legacy Coalition, with FCON having set the renting alliance of the Circle of Two Alliance, one of the heads of the Legacy Coalition, blue. Although this deal does seem to be of mutual benefit to both parties, given that Circle of Two equally blued up FCON's renting alliance. In short, it's too early to tell where Phoenix Federation's loyalties lie with regards to the new Legacy Coalition, but their past actions do indicate that they are at least tangentially aligned to the DRF through the influence that the Vanguard Coalition holds over them. As previously noted, the primary contributor to this coalition is Fidelis Constans, with its renting alliance Integrias Constans also making up the second largest alliance within the coalition. However, they have also collected a group of allies to aid them in holding these two regions, including Army of New Eden, Legio de Mortem, the Blood Covenant, Fubar, and the Serenity Initiative, as well as Off the Reservation, Perfect Dark, and Asteria Concord. The next area we're going to take a look at is what I can only describe as the deep south of Eve, although you're more likely to hear Sukabliats than you are shitty banjos, with the regions of Faithopolis and Omist being under the direct control of the DRF, though their relationship with the other powers in the area is a little different to the DRF as a whole, given that they are renters and not a direct military threat as the DRF is, which has led these entities to purchase blue standings from those who surround them, effectively paying off all of the local entities to not harass them as they try and make their risk. Amist, as talked about during the previous Winter War, is held by the Kids with Guns Alliance, and Faithopolis is held by Wings Wanderers. Although this control is actually shared with the renting alliance of the Legacy Coalition, Band of Backstabbers. And that little fact brings us rather neatly to the new kids on the block in terms of great powers, the Legacy Coalition, who've certainly not shied away from shaking up the political game, given that they were in fact the focal point of the last two great wars, with their eviction from the north by the Panfam Coalition triggering the Tribute War, and their efforts to find a new home and thus uprooting the Stain Wagon Coalition, leading to the Winter War. Following their success in acquiring said territory, we've seen a rapid period of growth from the Legacy Coalition, with them taking in several new alliances such as Brave Newbies, setting up renter alliances to monetize their newfound territory, and getting deep into the industrial Cold War, which is really fueling the tensions between the major powers in EVE Online currently, publicly declaring their intentions to create, quote, the biggest dread cache the game has ever seen, end quote. This likely stemming from the nature of their eviction by the Panfam Coalition, where supercapitals were leveraged quite heavily against them to nucleate fights in a way that they found it very, very difficult to win, given their own lack of a capital force at the time, which, by utilizing the new Soitoyo structures, and the still remarkably impactful levels of mineral output that the Rorqual can achieve, they can hope to in the future compete with by forcing a war of attrition against any enemy supercapitals which had attempted to leverage against them, given that it's much easier to replace a dreadnought than it is a supercarrier, especially in terms of lead time. However, only time will tell how effective this is, and more importantly if their members buy into this strategy, as it will require a lot of manpower to effectively achieve. One factor of note when looking at the Legacy Coalition, however, is simply that they lack a sphere of influence or any powers which are aligned to them in the area, only those that are directly controlled by them. This is likely partially to do with their relative recence in terms of coming to the south, with older, more stable great powers like the DRF and the Red Swarm Federation having had much more time to consolidate diplomatic and political understandings with any surrounding entities. But equally, their geographic position is an important factor in this, with diplomatic overtures in the east being blocked off by the Vanguard Coalition-aligned Phoenix Federation, and to their west, bitter enemies the Red Swarm Federation, whose allies they recently evicted from the south, leaving them with very few friendly faces to turn to. In fact, that proximity with the Red Swarm Federation could lead to potential issues in the future, as there are no neutral entities that are betwixt these two great powers that would potentially grab their attention before looking at one another. And whilst they don't seem to have an eye out for each other's demise quite yet, I can't help but think that this shared border is going to lead to friction in the future. If you watched my series on the Winter War, you'll find that the names involved in the Legacy Coalition are rather familiar, with Circle of Two and Test Alliance Please Ignore taking up the head of the coalition, along with other notable entities such as Brave Newbies, Dangerous Voltage, Drone Walkers, Who Dares Wins, Requiem Eternal, and Tactical Supremacy. all of whom were key players in the eviction of Steinwagen from Catch. And from the provocative new kids on the block, we actually turn to their polar opposite, one of the most long-standing and historically politically neutral entities in EVE Online, Proviblock, my personal home. I won't dwell too heavily on us, simply due to the fact that we are somewhat irrelevant in the larger metagame, and are effectively just kept around by every entity in the south as they enjoy roaming our space and fragging us relentlessly. Which, as an FC who lives there, is pretty great, because the content just delivers itself right to your doorstep. Still, underestimating Proviblock has been a recipe for disaster in the past, with their recent history of warfare against Triumvirate or Mercenary Coalition, and even before that, the small PanFam deployment to the area, having shown that they're at least capable of putting up a decent fight, if not winning. Still, the main quirk of Proviblock is its rules of engagement, with it primarily functioning under the not red, don't shoot philosophy, which effectively allows neutral entities to dip their toes into SOV for the first time without having to kiss the ring of a greater power. This philosophy also leads to a lot of splintering of factions within the area, as there's no need to join up to a blue entity when you can simply create your own and with a bit of work gain blue status. Which means that I'm going to need to take a deep breath before I attempt to list all of the alliances here. Curatores Veritatis Alliance, Uli Federation, Care Factor, The Shadows of Eve, COG, Elemental Tide, Severance, Evictus, Silent Infinity, Arcs Alliance, Warped Intentions, Gun Fun Alliance, and many, many others. Continuing our journey around the game, we get to the losers of the Winter War, Steinwagen, whom, as previously noted, have retreated to their eponymous region of Stein, to await the potential collapse of the Legacy Coalition, which would give them a chance to reclaim their homelands. And whilst they currently still do hold on to many of the valuable moons within Stein, they have been slowly bleeding members ever since the eviction, undergoing the archetypical trimming of the fat that we see when fair weather friends move on to greener pastures as a result of an eviction. This coalition also maintains its ties to the Red Swarm Federation, with these ties being strong enough that the Red Swarm Coalition even attempted to defend Steinwagen against the nascent Legacy Coalition as they were being invaded, though their efforts were not quite enough to prevent this eviction from occurring. In fact, the ties between the red part of the Red Swarm Coalition and the entities that comprise Steinwagen could not be underestimated. And should times get a little tougher in Stein, following, say, a Legacy Coalition attempt to burn the region to the ground, I wouldn't be surprised to see them fold in to the rest of the Red Swarm Federation, perhaps taking up SOV in period basis along with Red Alliance, Dreamfleet, and the other Russian entities that are a part of the Red Swarm Federation. As noted in my other videos, following their loss of the Winter War, they lost not only individual members, but also other members of the coalition as a whole, with alliances such as Volition Cult leaving the coalition, and alliances such as Sword of Damocles and Coven almost completely fail cascading, leaving them with significantly less manpower to work with. The four main alliances which remain are the Afterlife Dot, Soviet-Union, Against All Authorities, and Federation of Independent Stellar Systems. And now, at long last, we reach the fourth and final of our great powers, the Red Swarm Federation, which refers to a combination of both the Imperium and the Red Menace Coalition into one political entity, which is an arrangement that has a surprisingly huge amount of history behind it, which stretches all the way back to 2006, where Goonswarm and Red Alliance at the time stood together united against Band of Brothers, set to a backdrop of the beginnings of the Great War, which is the tale told by Andrew Groen's amazing book Empires of Eve. If you wish to read more about what they accomplished together, please go and read that book. It is fucking great. I've also decided to just colour the Quirius Fight Club as a hard member of the Red Swarm Federation, even though this is not technically the case, because at the end of the day, they are basically just there to fill space for the Imperium, as Quirius is one of the key routes of invasion towards Delve, which is their main stronghold. In addition, it gives them a great place to train their FCs, and also to potentially recruit alliances into the coalition should they see someone with promise. But despite their decline in territories held as a result of World War B, you really should not underestimate the Imperium or its allies, as they remain one of, if not the, most numerific coalition in the game currently, being able to field 1,000 pilots with relative ease. Not to mention having being bizarrely one of the few alliances in a position to really exploit the original release of the Rorqual, in which it was incredibly overpowered, giving them a huge surplus of minerals that served as a head start to the Industrial Cold War, which was touched on earlier, which has likely led to a bolstering of their supercap capabilities, or at the very least an increase of their line members' ability to get into capital ships, which is likely to be a huge advantage to them should they be either the instigator or defender in the next war between the great powers. And whilst obviously Goonswarm Federation is the main alliance in charge of the Super Coalition, Red Alliance, Bastion, Tactical Narcotics Team, Dreamfleet, and the Brothers in Arms Alliance all have a part to play within it. I'd also like to take a moment here to recognise that in the Quirius Fight Club, a reincarnation of Atlas Alliance has taken place, which is something that warms the cockles of my heart. And for those of you who've played the game for as long as I have, you'll know why. Next up, we have probably one of the most complicated regions for myself to dissect, Fountain. And this is due to the fact that not only do I not actively work in the area, so I'm not personally familiar with any of the alliances which roll around, it also seems to have two very distinct factions working inside of it, with the only thing that can draw them together being a potential goon invasion from the south. With the Culture, an alliance formed out of the remnants of Black Legion, which used to hold claim to the region, joining forces with Hedonistic Imperative and its Only Pixels, looking across the aisle at the original Fountain Core Coalition, which consists of Gangbang Team, Free Gates Coalition, and the Godfathers. Though even this political situation is relatively new, given that previously all of the forces in the Fountain were effectively focused at evicting Losegnia Shalopen from the region. Still, I will admit that this might not be entirely accurate as to the situation on the ground, with the only thing that I can really say for sure being that they are effectively neutral in terms of the great game, with all sides in Fountain simply wanting a place to live and good fights to have. Although, as we saw in World War B, the culture isn't above getting stuck in when they smell blood in the water. And finishing up on a rather odd note, we have Cloud Ring and its surrounding NPC regions of Outer Ring and Syndicate, which are quite frankly a clusterfuck of different influences, with previously mentioned the Culture holding systems that are close to Fountain, the Red Swarm aligned initiative taking systems close to their home region of Syndicate, Castabouts, which is a holding alliance for the Center of Advanced Studies, a newbie corporation which has a significant syndicate-based nullsec PvP group operating inside of it, as well as three smaller entities, Sarkos Federation, Suddenly Spaceships, and the Rebel Alliance of New Eden, all of whom are currently facing assault from Pandemic Horde, who has been active in the region for some time following the evacuation of Brave from the north. It should be noted that the direct weight of PanFam has not been leveraged in this war, with it primarily being a way to keep Pandemic Horde's FCs and pilots sharp in preparation for any future wars that may occur, following the same play patterns that we see in Pandemic Legion, where, if no major wars are currently occurring, they will retire to a region where they can just cause some havoc and keep themselves entertained so that no burnout or loss of membership due to inactivity occurs, which is a strategy that has suited them well in the past. We will have to see if this holds true for newbie alliances, however, as we've not seen this kind of playstyle done with a weaponized Newbro alliance such as Pandemic Horde. Equally, only time will tell how serious this invasion is by Pandemic Horde, and if they wish to hold the region or simply shake things up a little bit. If they do, it is likely that Pandemic Horde will either move to the region or that the PanFam coalition will rent it out as an extra little patch of renting space, bolstering the coalition's income stream even further. And so concludes my look at every single region of Nullsec and the political implications of the entities which live there. which I had originally hoped would last about 10 minutes. This whole thing took me roughly 15 hours to make, so I hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to discuss or dispute any of the postulations I've made regarding people's alignments here, as the subject matter is obviously rather opaque, and no one is ever black and white with this sort of thing. Still, I think this is a fair and accurate to the facts look at everything that's going on right now, but I hope that this is at least a little easier than trying to read between the lines of various battle reports. Anyway, stay tuned for part 2 of this quote-unquote mini-series, where I'm going to be looking at why I think there is going to be a war in the fall, what's spurring it on, and who the big winners and losers are going to be. But until then, fly smart and take care.